Welcome back to Economic Outlook. Today I want to discuss the results of the recent G20 summit in Seoul, South Korea. Given the ongoing global financial crisis, as well as recent debates over trade protectionism and currency devaluation, the Seoul summit had the potential to generate interesting policies from the world's most important economies. Today, let's see what the summit actually produced and see if the results lived up to the expectations. So the question is, did the summit live up to its expectations? And the answer is no, it did not. The policies are muddled at best, and they lack any kind of numerical specificity, which would be helpful for countries when they're actually measuring economic production or output. The summit generated two documents, and I've posted both of them on my website. The first is called the Summit Declaration, and it's essentially an executive summary of what the leaders feel were the most important points discussed at the meetings. The second document is actually called the Summit Document, and it gives more specific guidance on what the leaders viewed were the important policy decisions reached during the meeting. This is supposed to lay the framework by which the countries will operate, and I had hoped it would have some specific numeric targets, and unfortunately it doesn't. And I'll go into some examples of why this may be a problem in just a moment. One of the most important topics that dominated the discussion at many of the summit meetings was the issue of trade imbalances. And unfortunately, the committee makes only very vague recommendations about how they will measure trade imbalances and combat the problems that they create. Trade imbalances were the most important topic at the G20 meetings. Trade imbalances occur when export-oriented countries interact with debt-laden consumer nations. A good example is the United States and China. China produces goods which the United States purchases, and when they purchase these goods, the United States begins to run a current account deficit because the dollars used to purchase the goods flow to China. China builds up a surplus supply of dollars, and then they have to invest those dollars somewhere, so they'll buy something like United States government debt. And eventually, these types of imbalances, seen at a macro global level, cause economic instability. During the financial crisis, modern developed nations tended to run current account deficits, while developing countries, like China, would run current account surpluses. This causes all kinds of stress on the relationship between different currencies, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. For example, Germany has a very highly developed economy, but it's also the world's second largest exporter behind China. They export fewer consumer goods. It's more sort of high-level manufactured goods, so things further along in the production process. But in general, more developed countries have run up surprising debt loads, and other developing countries have huge trade surpluses. So the G20, one of the goals of this G20 meeting was to come to some consensus over the levels of current account surplus or debt that countries could have. Unfortunately, the summit was only able to agree upon what Reuters calls frameworks for balanced growth, and I think that's a good summary. Member countries will submit medium-term economic plans to the general body, but there really aren't any enforcement procedures or any kind of consensus behind quantitative numeric targets. And for example, the United States had hoped that countries would agree to have a certain percentage of current account surplus or deficit. And I don't know exactly what the figures would be, but for example, we might say that a country should only have a 10% current account surplus. And the leadership body wasn't able to come to any consensus over quantitative numeric measures. Instead of firm numbers, the member countries decided to use what they call indicative guidelines. And I looked in the document to see some more information about what these guidelines might be. And here's what I found. In section 11 of the document, the leaders state, "We have a shared responsibility. Members with sustained, significant external deficits pledge to undertake policies to support private savings and, where appropriate, undertake fiscal consolidation, while maintaining open markets and strengthening export sectors. Members with sustained, significant external surpluses pledge to strengthen domestic sources of growth." All of this sounds fine and reasonable, but without quantitative targets, there really is no consensus. And pretty much any economic analyst would say, yeah, these are good ideas, but without any hard targets, there's very little to say that things will actually change from where they've been. So while this document might formalize some of that, it really doesn't provide any specific guidance. And when you have as many countries with disparate interests as the G20, with developing nations, developed economies, exporters, importers, different levels of debt, without any kind of numeric targets, this is really useless. So this was definitely a failure of the summit to not come to any more concrete recommendation than this. The next most important topic at the summit was the issue of currencies. Several developing markets like China are under pressure to allow their currencies to appreciate relative to some of their competitors. This would help to ease some of the imbalances that we discussed. However, there again was very little consensus over what different countries should do with their currencies. And this is a notoriously difficult topic to reach any kind of international consensus on. It's something that each individual nation views as almost a matter of sort of their own national security. And from the perspective of a country like China, it's hypocritical for the United States to come to meetings like the G20 summit asking to allow currency appreciation on the open market when the Federal Reserve itself is embarking on a $600 billion program to actually ease the United States dollar. A country could easily argue that the United States is being hypocritical here because we're asking other countries to allow their currency to appreciate while we are essentially allowing ours to intentionally depreciate relative to other currencies. So this essentially, this weakens the bargaining position of a major developed economy like the United States. It makes it very difficult for us to put pressure on other countries when we're perceived as engaging in some of the same types of, not manipulation, because it's a little bit different on a technical level, but just in terms of managing our own currency. It's very difficult to make demands of other countries when we're engaging in some of the same practices, just in a slightly different way. This is a little bit off topic from the G20 itself, but I've had a lot of people ask me about the United States quantitative easing program and sort of what this means and what actually happens. And essentially, the Federal Reserve will buy treasuries. And what happens when the Federal Reserve buys treasuries, it injects money into financial markets. And so $600 billion will essentially be pushed into financial markets. And when this happens, it increases the supply of money. This makes sense. You're basically putting new money into the market, so the supply increases. Okay, that makes sense. When there's more money available, when there's a greater supply, the theory is that institutions will be more willing to lend and lend at lower rates. So when the Federal Reserve makes these purchases, they're essentially trying to keep interest rates low and inject more money into the monetary supply. A third major topic at the meetings was international trade. This was specifically important for the United States because President Obama had a self-imposed deadline to finalize a free trade agreement with South Korea by the beginning of these meetings. And unfortunately, the president was unable to complete the free trade agreement. And I don't specifically know the reasons why the agreement wasn't finalized. There were issues over protectionism for automobiles in South Korea because of the importance of companies like Kia and Hyundai in South Korea. But I don't know the specifics over why this derailed the overall agreement. But it's just a sign of how fragmented the international economy is right now when two countries with such close relationships and, from everything I gather, good relationships on a personal level between the two leaders. When something like this happens and an agreement can't be reached, it's a sign that there are serious problems. And summits like this really reflect the different rifts that have occurred. It's almost impossible to coordinate policy. And maybe we really shouldn't be surprised that a meeting like this was unable to come to a more clear consensus. Really, the final major announcement coming out of the Seoul meetings was a shift in voting rights in the IMF. A further 6 percentage points were shifted toward more developing countries like China and Brazil. And overall, this is important on some levels, but really, if this is one of the headlines for a major G20 summit, that's probably a bad sign for the actual agreements that were reached. So in conclusion, I think it's difficult to call these meetings anything other than a stalemate and ultimately a failure. There were very few numeric targets set, very little consensus was reached, and even close partners like the United States and South Korea were unable to come to mutual free trade agreements. So in conclusion, the G20 meetings reflect the difficult financial and diplomatic times that countries are trying to operate in. And it's very difficult for everyone involved to reach consensus for how to restart the global economy. This is going to be a very long and difficult process, and hopefully future meetings will be more productive. Okay, thank you as always for joining me here at Economic Outlook, and I'll see you back here next week when I examine the recent recommendations by the chairpeople of the Deficit Reduction Committee in Washington. You won't want to miss some of the results of their recommendations. I'll see you next week. Thanks.